ready to start here with a little bit more information on one of my favorite characters. I'm gonna be talking about Mimosa today because he's the one that sticks out most recently in my mind because of how strong of a character he is. Um, as I mentioned in the previous video, he's also one that has a tendency to be the one other people tend to connect to a lot due to his build and the way he reacts to things around him. His original creation, what came about at the probably close to the beginning of Crimson Rose. He was actually born in the story, but when he was born, he was not called Mimosa. His name was Raven, and he was one of the 3 princes that were originally born to the king and Hayato. I'm not going to go too deep into his history because even though I've already seen several shows and books and things that have gone into the high fantasy realm, one of the more notable being Game of Thrones, where people were of the scenarios and ewed by some of it. There are a little bit of similar fantasy background for Mimosa and his family. What I will say is that his very first love turned him away because of devotion to the king. His second love did similar, and I want to say that his first love, really, out of all of them, that was the hardest one for me to play, because I was not playing as Mimosa, I was playing as the one that he was in love with, and I wanted them to be together, but at the same time, we needed the extra conflict, I guess, and we wanted it to be a little harder than just him getting his way all the time. So, I had that character devoted to the king rather than to him. The second one that he fell in love with, well, there was a lot more involvement. He had a lot more reasoning other than I just want to be the one he looks at. It was based off of the power scheme of the character as well. He could not leave the people he was devoted to, because even if he'd wanted Mimosa, his powers actually bound his soul to those that he was involved with, but Mimosa didn't understand that, and so all he really saw and felt with that second love was somebody that claimed to love him, but in the end really didn't show it, and that tore him apart, especially when he saw so much betrayal happen from the one that he loved, not towards him. It was the other characters that he was devoted to that were betraying Hayato, or there you go, he was betraying Hayato left and right, and Mimosa didn't understand why he wouldn't just walk away for somebody that would actually be loyal and true and be there for him when he needed it. Because the alternative was to continued to exist as little more than an object that several people were fighting over. And when it came time for that to culminate, it wasn't really, unlike with a lot of people where they decide how things are going to go. Me and the other player, we create characters, and the way they're created, they have their own sense of things. So we sometimes don't even realize how it's going to play out until it's already done. With Mimosa, this happened a lot of the time. We were not expecting the reactions. So what ended up happening is the two of them ended up having a love affair, and we were almost wanting Hayato to go to Mimosa, but at the same time, it was just not an actual feasible possibility for him to. And it ended up where Mimosa's feelings of betrayal weren't entirely accurate. It was an unintentional betrayal, in that the current person with Hayato had to explain to him who he had been with because he was going to have a child. And he didn't want the other person claiming that child. And unfortunately, this led to Mimosa being in a situation where he was punished for it in one of the most devastating ways. He lost his home, he lost his pride, and he lost the only person that was loyal to him, or seemed to be loyal to him at that time, all because Hayato revealed who the father of the child was. And Mimosa, I don't know if he really ever fully recovered from it, or rather I should say Raven. And due to the fact of what happened afterwards, I really can't honestly say he did, because he became Mimosa after all of that happened. In fact, it was the end result to it. But after that betrayal, he was tempted by Oblivion, who was the ultimate villain at that point in the story. And Oblivion offered to get rid of all the corruption that Raven was seeing around him. And in return for joining him, Raven would be given power. He wouldn't have to deal with the punishment anymore. He could escape and be free, and Oblivion would help him to accomplish anything he wanted to. Now, the problem with this was Mimosa did understand that Oblivion's main goal was to basically end all existence. And when he followed Oblivion away, he actually told Oblivion, "Don't call me Raven. Raven died there on my bed. I am Mimosa." And he followed Oblivion into a dimension that was outside, both outside and existing within the realm that they were in. It didn't take long for Mimosa to decide that he didn't want to die or cease to exist. And there were people that he actually did want, that he had accumulated during a short span on the throne himself, before ending up in the underworld with Xolotl. And one of those people was a royal guard by the name of Vivias. What stood out about Vivias above all the other people that Mimosa had known was Vivias never claimed to be loyal to a single person. He had one-sided relationships most of the time. The first one being with Shivek, who was the captain of the guard. And that relationship ended when the king, Kiot, finally accepted the unrequited love of the captain, and Vivias learned that Shivek was, as he saw it, more in love with Kiot than he was with Vivias. Mimosa saw it for what it really was, that there had never really been any love for Vivias. Vivias was just his way of getting relief when he couldn't have what he wanted. What Mimosa couldn't see and didn't understand was that Shivek did actually care about Vivias. He just didn't love him the same way Vivias loved Shivek. And so, in joining Oblivion, he made one prerequisite. He wanted to have Vivias to himself, because he believed he could turn Vivias against everyone that had ever betrayed him. Not betrayed Mimosa, but betrayed Vivias. And because Vivias' loyalty wasn't to a person, it was to the throne itself, which meant the people that had been on it weren't really the people he was supposed to be loyal to. There had been another betrayal during his time, during that short span that I mentioned as king, that Mimosa had. He had given up on his first love, and his second love at the time, because it's fantasy, we had a lot of resurrections, but at the time, Hayato was dead, so there was no getting Hayato. So he had taken another, and the one that he took, I don't think Mimosa realized it, but the one that he had taken as queen felt like it was more done out of "you're my last resort" than actual caring, because Mimosa treated him like he was essentially someone to go and just do things to when he felt like it, but really when it came time to like talk things over or decide on some kind of action for the kingdom, he never really listened to his queen. His queen was just sort of there as a symbol rather than a living entity that had opinions of his own. And that came back to bite him, because that person was very bent on the idea of justice and doing the correct thing when getting one's justice. And Mimosa's idea of justice was to break or destroy the people that he felt betrayed him or someone he cared about. And of course he saw Kiot as someone that had betrayed Hayato, someone that had hurt him, and therefore Kiot needed to suffer the same way Hayato had, and since that betrayal had ended with Hayato's death, Mimosa had every intention of tormenting Kiot until he was gone, and unfortunately for Mimosa, that was a line that his queen wouldn't cross. He didn't feel it was right. He did not feel it was justified because he realized that Kiot had not intended Hayato's death, and in the end had actually loved Hayato and was already suffering because of the death and because it was his fault. And so when Mimosa took Kiot, it fractured whatever feeling had been there between the two of them. And in the end, it was his queen that helped end that reign because he saw Mimosa as being this ultimate monster that could not be reasoned with. Even though when I look at it, or when anybody else might look at it, they might just see somebody that had been hurt too many times, and just didn't trust anyone. And just wanted justice for himself. And since nobody else would give it, Mimosa had to create that justice on his own. And he had no one to look to for a real idea as to how to serve that kind of justice. So when Oblivion did come, he had no reason to turn Oblivion away at that point, at least not in his mind. Oblivion had offered him the freedom to do as he pleased without any repercussions. He could get everything he ever wanted, and there would be no one left to stop him. Now, I'll be honest, he knew what Oblivion wanted, so I can't say for sure whether I can honestly claim Mimosa has never betrayed anyone. In a way, he did. But it was a betrayal that both parties were well aware was going to take place. So they were both expecting it. There was no surprise to it. And Oblivion accepted the fact that that it was going to happen before it ever happened. Because he knew Mimosa did not want to cease to exist after a while inside of Oblivion's domain. He could see that Mimosa was just wanting revenge, which Oblivion wanted as well, and part of him started to almost see Mimosa as a reflection of himself. And I don't know whether Oblivion was hoping Mimosa could change his mind or not, but in the end, it came down to the fact that the two of them did actually care for each other. They just did not agree, and unfortunately the agreement was on something that if they didn't agree, then they both weren't really on the same side, because Oblivion was going to go through with his plan no matter what, and Mimosa wouldn't be willing to die or cease to exist. And when he took Vivias, Vivias recognized the flaw in their alliance, and kept trying to talk Mimosa out of the alliance, get him to leave. And Mimosa kept trying to explain to him that he already understood what Oblivion was after. That they couldn't do what they wanted and Oblivion have what he wanted at the same time. But there were a few times where Mimosa attempted to also, in a way, I guess, from what I can understand, he was trying to tell Vivias that he wanted to try and convince Oblivion to not go through with it. Of course, all this happened after he had already captured Vivias, and within the first few days of them both being in Oblivion, Mimosa had tried to militaristically change the way Vivias thought and how he acted and where his loyalties lay. And he thought he had, but in changing Vivias into Crow, he hadn't realized the side effects. And the side effects for doing so, basically made it so that Crow didn't let anyone get close to him, like physically or emotionally or in any other fashion. He just kept people at arm's distance. And Mimosa thought this was due to the training and that all of it was his fault. But in the end, what it was Vivias had seen that strain, that impossibility of being able to side with Oblivion, and also recognized something that Mimosa was kind of almost seemingly in denial of, which was that he was starting to actually care about Oblivion, and Oblivion didn't seem to reciprocate those feelings. And having been in so many relationships where Vivias had given himself utterly to someone only to not have that returned and be left with the pain of knowing those people didn't care about him, not in the same way, meant Vivias was worried and wary about such situations, and he knew it was going to end up hurting Mimosa in the end. And so he had to keep Oblivion at arm's length, and he felt that maybe Mimosa was susceptible to people that seemed to care but didn't really, not to the same depth. And in order to prevent himself from falling for the same types of things over again, Vivias refused to let people get close to him because he wanted to protect Mimosa. Of course, this showed in the fact that Vivias literally would attack people that tried to get physically close to him. And so Mimosa began blaming himself for what seemed to be an impossibility of Crow being able to be around people. And they lacked good communication, honestly. And that caused a lot of issues later on between them. But Crow would eventually try to explain to him that not only was it not his fault that he didn't let anyone near him, it was out of an attempt to keep Mimosa himself safe. And once Mimosa realized that their bond was nigh unbreakable, but at the same time, Mimosa started to question whether he had any right to Crow at all. But they were inseparable. It got to a point where we attempted to separate the characters because we wanted to know what would happen if Crow and Mimosa were not pretty much nigh on literally joined at the hip. And so we threw them a major plot hook, which ended with Vivias Crow dying. And it was not what we expected. Mimosa went into a near mental and emotional breakdown, and he was literally on the verge of just becoming another Oblivion. And so we had to come up with a way for him to rescue Crow from the underworld. And it was a very long story plot, and it had a lot of really hard parts to get through because it was extremely emotional. It wasn't like somebody killed Crow either. Due to the way the story had gone, people in the kingdom only grow to be in the prime of their adulthood. Once they reached that point, they stopped aging. But due to Oblivion's storyline, they had broken the magic that kept everyone from getting older. And what happened when they did that was a lot of the people that had been there since the time that the king had come began to age rapidly, and Vivias was one of those. They hadn't reached their max potential yet in power, and so they were still quite capable of dying of poison or old age, and that's just what was happening. He was growing old and dying. Mimosa was powerful enough at that point that even with the magic removed, he still was young and capable and had a lot of time ahead of him. So it meant Mimosa would be alone. And I don't think that character really can be alone. He needs people. No matter how much he wants to believe otherwise about himself, he just does. He's that the feelings of abandonment and betrayal and everything that was built into him made it impossible for him to be able to recover from that. And so we ended up bringing Crow back, and we decided that we wouldn't ever try to separate them again. It just once was enough for us to see that we couldn't do that and expect Mimosa to be able to handle it. But that's his story up to the Oblivion crisis. And up until that point, my friend and I were sharing the character. They would play it part of the time. They would play him part of the time, and I would play him the other part of the time because they were interacting with all the other characters, and it was really hard to play him interacting with our own characters. It became a monologue rather than us enjoying a role play, and so we shared him up until that point. But once it became obvious that most of the people Mimosa was going to be interacting with were going to be mine, the character became solidly my partner's character in the storyline. But because I had helped build him out so much, there were still things I wanted to do with the character personally. So outside the storyline, I began pulling him into stories that my fiance and I had, and even a couple of other role plays I had going on. But the difference between him and some of my other characters I've created by myself was that Mimosa continued to have the memories that were being created in the original storyline. So despite having the memories of new worlds and new places, he also had memories of his original home. And they continued to expand, so he didn't remain just remembering the beginning of the story. He continued to collect memories from my partner's version of him, and eventually that would lead to the issue I now have with the character where he doesn't understand what happened. All of a sudden everything just seemed to stop or cease to exist, and has him struggling to grasp and be okay with the fact that his home and everything about him in that world is now gone. But I'll get into that with tomorrow's episode. I think I'm gonna leave it there. We're at the cutoff junction where I was starting to play a version and my partner was starting to play full time for Crimson Rose. And I'll get into the other half of Mimosa and how my version re-entered Crimson Rose while at the same time managing to occupy an entirely different world. I hope you all enjoyed it, and if you liked it, like it. If you want to subscribe, please do so, and I'll catch y'all later. Enjoy your day.